JBS presents the Hampton Synagogue's Author Discussion Series with Rabbi Avraham Bronstein.
Ladies and gentlemen, Mark Gerson, welcome to the Hampton Synagogue. First, just general question. The Passover Seder is something that Jewish families do around the world. It's the most practiced Jewish ritual that we have. So lots of people are doing it. Not everybody decides to write a book about it. So how did this book come about?
Well, it's a good question. It came about, it was probably around 15 years ago, and I was having a cigar with my friend Jeff Laban at Club Macanudo on East 63rd Street, and he said, would you like to study the Haggadah? And I'd studied the Torah with Jeff before, and I knew what a great teacher of Torah he was, and I said, of course I'd like to study the Haggadah, but I wasn't aware there was anything to be studied. And so we took out the Haggadah, and we just started to study a couple of the passages, and it was a fascinating cigar. And then, so I, subsequent to then, I went home and just started to study, and in that process, which has never ended and God willing never will, because the Haggadah is really an endlessly generative text, the greatest hits of Jewish thought. And what I realized is that the wisdom of the Torah is distilled into the Haggadah, and therefore the Haggadah, it's not a holiday manual or a dinner guide, it's the guidebook for life. And basically all of life's great questions are asked and answered in the Haggadah. You just have to know how to read it. And so this book is the culmination of more than a decade of discovering the seemingly endless wisdom that's in this book that we read every Pesach.
Okay, so I think a second question that kind of builds on the first. So in the introduction to the book, you spent some time kind of figuring out what genre of literature the Haggadah falls into. And
right.
you mentioned that a little bit in your last answer, right? You talked about whether it's a guidebook or whether it's a manual, whether it's a teaching. And the truth is there's all different things, there's all different types of literature that are part of the Haggadah, because the Haggadah itself was compiled over a series of several hundred years. And it's not entirely clear even historically kind of how it happened. You can kind of piece the pieces apart. So maybe you can reflect on that a little bit more. Why is it important to figure out what genre the Haggadah falls into? And then once you know kind of what the genre is, so then what can you do with that?
Yeah, it's really fundamental to the understanding of any text, particularly the Haggadah, but really any text. I mean, if we pick up a work of historical fiction and we think the genre is history, we're going to be disappointed and confused, and that would be a mix-up of the genre. Mm-hmm. And when mix-ups of genres happen, the reading experience, or really whatever the medium is, it simply doesn't work. And that's often what happens with the Haggadah, is that people sometimes treat the Haggadah as a dinner program, kind of one of those things at those benefit dinners in New York and presumably elsewhere, where there's speaker after speaker and you're looking at the program, counting how many speakers are left before either the food or you can go home. Knowing laughter, right? We've all been there, right? And unfortunately, a lot of people will look at the Haggadah like that. In other words, let's just get through this so that we can get to the meal. And that's a mix-up in the genre, because it is not a dinner program. It's not a holiday manual. It is the greatest hits of Jewish thought. And that is really what it is, and it's because of what Pesach is. Pesach is two things. It is the Jewish New Year. It's the authentic Jewish New Year. Rosh Hashanah is perhaps a Jewish New Year, but it's nowhere in the Bible, nowhere in the Torah. Pesach in the Torah is called the head of months. So the head of months is, of course, our New Year. So what do we do with the New Year? Jewishly and in the secular context, we do the same thing. We take an existential inventory of who we are. We consider how we were in the past. We consider who we are now. And we make resolutions and commitments so that we can become the kind of person that we want in the year to come. That's what we do with the New Year, and that's what the Haggadah exists to help us do. It helps us to understand who we are now. It helps us to project what kinds of people we want to be and to make those resolutions and commitments to be that kind of person. And in order to help us fulfill that great potential and that awesome opportunity, the Haggadah is the distillation of Jewish wisdom to help us understand ourselves now and who we want to be in the future.
So the way that you're describing it, it almost sounds as though the Haggadah is really much more than just a Passover night kind of thing.
Right. Absolutely.
It's never really occurred to me to pick up a Haggadah and to read it, let's say, around now, in July or August or in November, let's say.
Right.
But you're saying really, we should be doing that because the topics that are brought up are really relevant not just for the observance of Passover, but for the whole year.
Exactly right. Exactly. It is the greatest hits of Jewish thought. Distilled for our new year. And we can declare New Year tonight. We can say tonight is going to be a new year for me. And all that means is I'm going to really take an inventory of who I am now and make commitments for the future. And in fact, Judaism has multiple New Years. So it's fine to say Rosh Hashanah is a new year. We have several New Years in Judaism. We have several New Years in the secular context. We have January 1st. We have our National New Year on July 4th. We have our personal New Year on our birthday. We have the school year, New Year in September. We might have a fiscal New Year. We might have a relationship New Year on our anniversary. The notion of multiple New Years is not even interesting, but it's important because a New Year is too great an opportunity to happen only once every 12 months. So whenever one wants to declare a New Year, whether it's Rosh Hashanah, whether it's Pesach, well, of course it's Pesach, or whether it's tonight, the Haggadah is there to help guide us into having the most fulfilling both moment and year to come, but you have to know how to read it. So the passages, each passage in the Haggadah, especially those that are most familiar to all of us, is full of wisdom and is completely interesting, but we have to know how to read it. And what the purpose of my book is to really show both how fascinating, how instructive, and how important each of these passages are, so that when we contemplate the passage, whether at the Seder or tomorrow night, whenever tomorrow night is, we can get that kind of meaning that the authors of the Haggadah, the original authors of the Haggadah thousands of years ago, intended for us to derive.
So you've been saying that the Haggadah is a distillation of the greatest hits of Jewish thought. So what are some of those greatest hits?
Oh, well, let's just pick any passage. Basically, or if anyone has a favorite passage from the Haggadah, we could just do that one if anyone's thinking about one. All right, I just opened to page 173. Go and learn what Laban the Aramean attempted to do to our father Jacob. Okay, so this is a familiar passage to everybody. And so what does this mean? So, without unaided, a lot of us would just skip over this. But what's the first interesting thing here? The first interesting thing is if we wanted to teach our child a lesson, say we want to teach our child about math, we would typically say, come here and let's go over your homework. We would say, come here, right? But we don't say come here in this context. We say, go and learn. So why would we say go and learn? Go is a very strange word to use for a learning process, except in the Jewish context, it's how we learn. We learn by going out into the world. In other words, if we want to understand complex characters, the people who populate our lives, particularly people like Laban, who's a deeply complex and bad guy in the Bible, we really have to go out into the world. So the Jewish notion of learning is a constant dialectic. It's you have to go out into the world and have these very worldly, very secular experiences, but there's nothing really secular because we should always approach every experience as a Jew, but just whether it's our job, whether it's our play, whether it's our relationships, we go into the world, we learn from everyone, we learn from everything. Everything is instructive, and then we come back and we study. And then we take our studies into the world, we take our worldly learnings into our studies, and it becomes an endless dialectic, which is why all the ancient rabbis, and even medieval rabbis whose names that we all know, they all had professions. Maimonides was a doctor, Nachmanides was a doctor, Rashi was in the wine business, Akiva was in the shoe business. They all had professions. And why? Because they were all manifesting the notion of go and learn. In other words, they went into the world, they bought, they sold, they transacted, they served patients, and they learned from each of those interactions. And in the early commentary on these rabbis was that rabbis would be, if a rabbi was working too much at his studies and not enough at his profession, he would be criticized for being an insufficiently good rabbi. Because the early notion was that in order to be a great rabbi, in order to be a great teacher, in order to truly understand Judaism, you had to go out into the world. So therefore we learn in order to a Jewish education really involves going into the world. So then we say, go and learn what Laban the Aramean attempted to do to our father Jacob. And then it continues to say that Laban is worse than Pharaoh. Now, how is Laban worse than Pharaoh? Laban was a bad guy. I mean, he tricked his son-in-law Jacob into marrying both of his daughters. Worse than that, he denied his daughter Rachel, her husband, and sowed jealousy by having Jacob marry both Rachel and Leah. Bad guy. But on the other hand, he loved Jacob. I mean, he wanted him in his household forever. And when Jacob wanted to leave, Laban was upset and tried another ruse to keep Jacob to stay. So how is he worse than Pharaoh? Sure, he's a bad guy, but worse than Pharaoh? Pharaoh's the first eliminationist anti-Semite. So we really learn in the biblical text, which is alluded to in this Haggadah passage, 2 lessons about Laban and as to why he's such a destructive character. And we learn why we can survive the Pharaoh, but why Laban, at least according to the authors of the Haggadah, is a greater threat. So, number one, what does every good parent want from his or her children? The one thing all good parents want is we want our children to love each other and to get along together. Why? Because our job as parents is to watch over our children, and we know that at some point we'll be unable to do that because, God willing, they will survive us. So at that point, when we're dead, who do we want to watch over our children? Well, their spouses, sure, but the divorce rate is high now. It's probably always been high. Certainly the marital unhappiness rate we know from the Bible has always been high. Not so dependable. So who's dependable? Our children's siblings. So every good parent just derives so much joy from having their children have a good relationship because it is so important forever. So what did Laban do? Laban sowed jealousy among his children for his own purposes. What kind of parent would do that? So this is the internal enemy, the parent who sows, who would do this? To engineer a situation where your 2 daughters have a lifetime of jealousy and enmity towards each other to advance your momentary aims. Who would do that? Well, Laban did it. The second thing, and I credit Rabbi Riskin with this, is that when Jacob, when he went on his journey, he's exiled from his potentially murderous brother Esau. He goes on his journey. He has that great dream, Jacob's ladder, and he dreams of the great Jewish dream of uniting heaven and earth, where the angel is starting on earth and going up in heaven. The great Jewish dream uniting heaven and earth. When he's done with Laban, what's he dreaming about? Spotted and speckled sheep. He's dreaming about money. Money as divorced from anything holy. Now, money can be a holy instrument, but divorced from anything holy. At that point, Jacob realizes he had to leave. And what we learn is that whoever controls someone's dreams controls that person. So if we're not dreaming right, we can't act right. So what did Laban do? He ended up manipulating Jacob's dreams. And that is the most existentially dangerous thing one person can do to another, is to give them a bad dream. And that's what Laban did.
So all that's in the book.
All that's in the book, and all that can be derived from that, and more. And all that can be derived from that passage. It's so instructive because it encourages us to think about how do we learn, and not how do we learn as Jews going back way back when, but certainly that. But more importantly, this is a guidebook for life. So how can I learn today? And so we should leave this passage and realize that I'm going to go to my workplace or to my school or to my family, to my relationships tomorrow, and I'm going to learn from everybody. And I'm going to learn from everything. And I'm going to take that back to my Jewish studies, and I'm going to take my Jewish studies back to that. And so this is what the Haggadah is telling us to do. And it's such an important lesson, all from that one line.
So I guess the question then is, just over the course of writing this book, first, how long did it take you to write this book, from conception until publication?
Well, it's a good question. I guess the research started with that first cigar with Jeff.
Yeah.
But the writing, so what we started doing was probably about 7 or 8 years ago now. We started hosting Pesach preparation sessions where we'd go through the Haggadah for whoever wanted to come to our apartment and to learn before their seders. And then we kept getting really gratifying responses afterwards about what they learned about what each passage could mean really made their seders special and meaningful and generated all kinds of interesting and productive discussion. And then it just occurred to me, why don't I just really occurred to me because my friend Ken Melman suggested it. He said he was at one of our seders, and he said, well, everything that we just discussed based upon all these passages, why don't you write that into a book? And I said, good idea. So that process took probably, but not full time, by no means full time, but so it's a labor of love. It's the learning of a lifetime, and so it took 3 15 years in one calculation, but maybe a year in another calculation.
So if you're thinking about kind of your own evolution, your own process, as this book came together and you really tried to crystallize the lessons and crystallize the ideas in it, and you think about maybe how your own family seders have changed over that time, or how you've incorporated the lessons that you're writing about and that you're developing into your home life in that way, are there one or two lessons that really jump out that were transformative to yourself personally that maybe you didn't even expect when you were writing them into the book?
Yes, great question. I would say one lesson is transformative. Never underestimate children. And we, in our home, and Erica is a rabbi over there, we have no Torah children's books, no Jewish children's books in the home. They are banished from the home because kids can learn the real thing. These Bible children's books, they omit a lot of the important and interesting aspects, but more importantly, kids can learn the real thing. And we know this because every Saturday, if anyone wants to join on Zoom, just let me know. We'd love to have you. But we have Parsha study sessions, very similar to the Pesach preparation sessions that we were doing for years. It's pretty much exactly the same thing. Kids age 6 and up come. 5-year-olds, it's difficult. 6, they start to be able to participate along with everybody else. By 7, they can all do it. They can all do it. By 7, they can engage in in-depth textual analysis, conversation, learning, and understanding, just like adults can in the same conversation. And so one thing, and this is in the Bible, where in Deuteronomy it says that the Bible is given to be read by everyone together. Men, women, children, the stranger, the prostitute, everybody's together. And the Bible, as always, is right in that children can learn with adults and can participate in discussions with adults. And at the Seder, this becomes evident too, because it's what I encourage people to do is just pick up the book, and there's no way anyone can get through everything in the book. We certainly can't. Nobody can. So the timing wouldn't work. Everything in the book at a Seder, but pick 2 to 4 passages that I write about in the book and that are meaningful to you or anybody else at the Seder and focus on them. But the kids are going to be able to participate, and they're often going to bring insights that adults won't. But never underestimate kids and their ability to participate in adult conversations, to understand adult concepts, and have the Bible really speak to them in a deep and profound way. And I think it starts at 6, and then by 7, it's not even an interesting conversation anymore. They're just like everybody else in the room.
Is that the meaning of life?
Well, as you said, the meaning of life will only be revealed with a significant contribution to the synagogues.
Sounds good. Okay. Maybe a final question from me, and then I think you've sparked enough interest from the audience that we can take a few questions from there. Talk to me about the reception to the book. Right? Not every haggadah that's published, and God knows that dozens are published every single year. They don't make the bestseller lists, and this book was named the bestseller by the Los Angeles Times, within weeks of its publication. So I want you to just reflect on that a little bit. I mean, for yourself. How gratifying is it to write a haggadah that kind of breaks through into the popular culture that way? And also, just in terms of the way you read the larger landscape, right? You don't write a bestseller, and we've proven this in this series, by writing books that only Jews buy and read. So that means that a lot more people than American Jews bought this book. And my question to you, part 2, is if you're not Jewish and you're reading this book, what do you think that they should be taking from it? And also, the fact that this book was so popular, what does that show about the moment that we're in, maybe culturally in America?
Great question. What was that advertisement? I think a little before my time. You don't have to be Jewish to enjoy Goldberg's rye?
No, Levy's. Levy's rye.
Oh, what? Whose rye?
Levy's.
Oh, sorry, Mr. Goldberg. Sorry, Mr. Levy. Yeah, you don't have to be Jewish to enjoy Levy's rye. Okay, so you don't have to be Jewish to, but the ad worked because it was kind of funny, but it's a great question we ask because it's very serious in the following sense, is that we are living right now in a world historical moment, which is that of Jewish-Christian friendship, and friendship in the deepest and most profound way, friendship that is really love. We have been waiting thousands of years to have friends like we have among Christians now. I mean, we were cursed in the book of Numbers by Balaam, who said, "You will be a people who dwells alone." But now the curse is lifted. We are no longer a people who dwells alone because we have so many genuine friends among evangelical Christians. And I was the beneficiary of that experience with the reception of the book, where in March of 2021, this year, when the book came out, it was all virtual because everything was still virtual then, but I was doing 4 to 5 events a day with churches, full of Christians who wanted to understand the Jewish roots of their faith, and particularly out of just this deep love for the Bible and the Jewish understanding of the Torah. And they wanted to learn how Jews interpret the biblical passages that they're familiar with, and they really wanted to understand the Bible from a Jewish perspective, and they love all things Jewish, whether it's the Jewish state, the Jewish people, Jewish teachings, the Jewish religion, all things Jewish. And it's a very special moment we're in, and I was really very gratified and fortunate to be able to participate in it by through this book. And it is our shared text. They call it the Old Testament, we call it the Torah. It's the same book.
Do you think the message that a Christian would take from this book is similar to the message a Jew should take from this book? Or are there different things that Jews and Christians can take out?
It's a great question. I mean, it's the lessons of the Haggadah are almost all universal lessons. Almost all, maybe even all, at least the ones that I wrote about in really the Megid section of the Haggadah, which is the beginning of the part that everyone's familiar with. They're universal lessons, and the Torah is of course God's gift to the Jews, but what's the Jewish purpose? Well, our purpose is to be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation, so that we can, per Isaiah, be a light unto the nations. And we see in this upcoming Parsha Devarim, it says Moses explained, and then people say, well, what does it mean Moses explained? It references languages. Well, it's that Moses began to explain. In other words, he began to translate it into the 70 languages of the world. 70 languages of the world at the time. So why would he translate it into 70 languages of the world? Because the Torah is for everybody. It's for all 70 languages. And the wisdom of the Torah, the life lessons, the Haggadah is the original self-help book. And really the Torah is the original self-help book. The Haggadah is the great derivation of the Torah. And the lessons there are universal and can be learned, loved, and acted upon by all people. And it's one of the great Jewish gifts to the world. So it was really a pleasure for me to be able to share it through all the book discussions with Christians that I did.
I find the Haggadah to be the readings very disjointed.
Oh.
It doesn't have a flow, and that's why sometimes it's hard to get into, because it's one topic and then it's tefillah and another topic and a story and does that make sense that some
Totally.
people may be turned?
Yeah, it's a great observation. I mean, if a teacher gave a student the assignment, tell the story of the Exodus for the Jewish New Year, and the student returned with the Haggadah, the teacher would have 2 choices. Give him an F or an A+. Because it's either the kid's a complete genius and is just on another level, or it's completely disjointed. It barely mentions the Exodus. We begin to tell the story of the Exodus late through Deuteronomy, which is not how you'd ever tell the story of the Exodus. But yes, now the reason why it's disjointed is because it is the greatest hits of Jewish thought. And the authors of the Haggadah want us to really digest all of these great concepts, and they don't come in a neatly flowing narrative. And that's why we don't even begin telling the story really towards the end of Megid, and we do so in Deuteronomy, because the point of it is not to tell it as a narrative, but to get us to think about how did I do last year, who am I now, and who do I want to be in the future, and how can I become that? And each passage helps us to do that. But you're totally right. If one reads it as a narrative, it's going to make no sense. In that case, the student's getting an F.
Mark, would you take a few minutes and summarize the chapter on Pesach, the meaning, the real meaning? I thought that was so
thank you.
Intellectually and emotionally satisfying.
Oh, thank you. Sure. So one of the great misnomers is the term Passover, right? So I try never to use the term Passover because it is a terrible translation. I use the term Pesach, and so why not Passover? Because Passover implies that somebody passed over something. Well, nobody passed over anything. Now, the kind of what we learned in Hebrew school, or what some of us might have learned in Hebrew school that's wrong, is that on that night, the last night in Egypt, we put blood on our lintels so God could pass over the Jewish homes. God's going to need our help knowing which homes are Jewish? I mean, but that's the presumption, is that like God needs our help. Well, it is ridiculous, but even more so because in the previous plague, the plague of darkness, only afflicted the Egyptians. The Jews were exempt from it, and we didn't need to signify our homes in any way. So that presumption becomes even sillier because God somehow knew which homes were Jewish in the 9th plague and then forgot by the 10th plague? Then we needed the blood? No, that could not have happened because nobody passed over anything. So if nobody passed over anything, then what is Pesach? So the term Pesach means to hover over, which makes a lot more sense. And to hover over in a spirit of guarding, in a spirit of protecting. So why does this make a lot more sense? Because the firstborn, and we can get into that, what the firstborn means, does not mean the firstborn chronologically, but the firstborn in every Egyptian household were killed on that night. And by the destroyer, this is the term in the text, I think it's Exodus 12:41, by the destroyer. So if the destroyer is going over all the other homes, would we want God passing over our home? No. We'd want God hovering over our home. And we see that from, I think it's Isaiah 31:6, when it uses the term Pesach, which is the same term, and it said, like a mother bird Pesachs over her young. It's like a mother bird's hovering over her young, going like this, just protecting and guarding that child in his or her moment of vulnerability. And that's what God's doing on this night. God is hovering over our homes in this moment of vulnerability and watching over us. But no one's passing over anything.
What is the history of the compilation of the Haggadah? When was it put together and formed as a yearly service?
Yeah, nobody knows really the history. It's a very interesting question, and it's probably unknowable. I think if you look at Exodus 12, now one of the amazing things about the Pesach experience and the Seder experience is that we are literally reliving Exodus 12. So we say on Pesach night, we're reliving and retelling the story. Absolutely, totally right. Is that even people who don't read the Bible, don't study the Bible, and everybody should, it doesn't matter where on the religious spectrum you are, or on any religious spectrum. It's the greatest book ever written, the Bible. But just read Exodus 12, and then we'll see what we're doing on Pesach is we're just living that night. Therefore, very much so. If Moses, of course the Haggadah didn't exist in the Torah, but if Moses came to any of our Seders, he would know exactly what we were doing. He would say, you were doing just what I told you to do. You were reliving and you were retelling the story of the Exodus. Now, he wouldn't recognize the Dayenu song, which I think was 14th century. He wouldn't recognize some of the other elements, but that doesn't matter. He would recognize exactly what we're doing, which makes the Seder the longest running or the oldest continuous religious ritual in the history of the world. I think probably every generation of Jews from Moses, we know this was in the desert from the first year. So I'm going to make the claim, every generation of Jews from Moses until today has done either a Seder or something closely resembling a Seder, which is astonishing. And that really shows what the Seder is, what the Haggadah is. So what is the Seder? It's a conversation both horizontally with us and other Jews around the world, and also vertically, because it's with us and all the Jews who came before us, and God willing will come after us. But so Moses, they didn't have the word Seder. That's another interesting topic. It means order, but it wasn't invented in the Torah, so Moses wouldn't have known the term Seder. But he certainly knew the experience of the Seder. And then it evolved over time, and then it became somewhat standardized several hundred years ago. But all the important aspects of it, in the sense that in the questions we ask, in the commitments we make, in the resolutions that we conceive, those are ancient and maybe the most ancient thing in the world.
Thank you so much, really.
Oh, thank you.